In the fall of 1945, the American fleet approached the shores of Japan. Operation Downfall began, the largest amphibious operation in human history. The United States was preparing to storm the homeland of the samurai. What if the atomic bombs hadn't forced Japan to surrender? What if the war had continued and millions of American soldiers had landed on Japanese islands? Today we'll dive into an alternative history of the bloodiest battle that could have changed the entire course of World War II. And at the end of this story, you'll learn what secret weapon the Japanese had prepared for the defenders and why. American generals called this operation the Gates of Hell. Summer 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Germany had capitulated, but in the Pacific. The war continued with escalating fury. The Japanese Empire, trapped in the ring of the American fleet, was preparing for the final battle on its own soil. In the deep bunkers of the Pentagon, American strategists bent over maps of the Japanese islands. Before them lay the plans for Operation Downfall, the code name for the invasion of Japan. The operation consisted of two phases: Olympic, the landing on Kyushu in November 1945, and Coronet, the assault on the Kanto Plain in Tokyo in spring 1946. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the operation, understood the scale of the coming ordeal. By his calculations, the success of the operation would require 5 million American soldiers, more than participated in the Normandy landings. The fleet would number 3,000 ships of all classes, from aircraft carriers to landing barges. But the Japanese weren't planning to surrender without a fight. Emperor Hirohito and the military command developed the Ketsugo Plan, the decisive battle for the homeland. Every Japanese person, from schoolchildren to the elderly, was to become a soldier. The islands prepared for 1 million regular troops and 28 million civilian militia. Armed with everything from rifles to sharpened bamboo spears, the coastline of Kyushu turned into a solid fortress. Thousands of pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, minefields. In caves and tunnels, the Japanese hid artillery ready to unleash a fiery barrage on the landed Americans. Kamikaze prepared 10,000 aircraft for the final attack. November 15, 1945. In our alternative history, Operation Olympic began. At dawn, thousands of American ships opened preliminary bombardment. The guns of battleships with 16-inch caliber tore apart Japanese fortifications. B-29s dropped tons of bombs on coastal cities, but when the first landing craft approached the shore, they were met by real hell. Japanese artillery hidden in caves opened devastating fire. Kamikaze wave after wave crashed into the American fleet. In the first day of the operation, the U.S. lost 12 destroyers and 2 cruisers. The landing on the beaches turned into a bloody massacre. Japanese soldiers holed up in bunkers didn't retreat a single step. They knew behind them were their homes, their families. American Marines went into attack under machine gun fire, suffering enormous losses. Private James Collins from the 1st Marine Division recalled later, "This was worse than Iwo Jima and Okinawa combined. The Japanese fought like demons. For every house, for every stone, we had to pay with blood." By the end of the first week, the Americans had captured only a narrow strip of coastline. Losses amounted to 50,000 killed and wounded, more than planned. For the entire operation, in the rear, the Japanese deployed guerrilla warfare. Every village became a fortress. The Japanese civilian population fought with fanatical devotion. Women and children threw themselves under tanks with grenades. Old men set up ambushes with homemade bombs. The slogan 100 million will die as one became reality. In December 1945, the fighting moved to the mountains of central Kyushu. Here the Japanese prepared a system of underground fortresses connected by tunnels. American soldiers had to burn out every cave with flamethrowers, blow up every bunker. Winter brought new trials. The Japanese climate proved to be no less deadly an enemy than enemy bullets. Americans, accustomed to the tropical climate of the Pacific, suffered from cold and disease. Supplying troops through destroyed ports became a logistical nightmare. By early 1946, it became clear Operation Olympic had failed. Instead of quickly capturing the southern part of Kyushu, the Americans got bogged down in bloody battles. Losses approached 200,000 people. Japanese resistance wasn't weakening. President Truman faced the most difficult choice. American society, tired of war, demanded the return of soldiers home. Newspapers wrote about the slaughter in Japan. Others went to demonstrations against continuing the war, but the military insisted on continuing. Operation Coronet, the assault on Tokyo. General MacArthur claimed that only the capture of the capital would break Japanese resistance. This required another 3 million soldiers from Europe. In spring 1946, the second phase of Operation Downfall began. The landing on the Kanto Plain, where Tokyo was located, was planned as the decisive blow. But the Japanese had prepared surprises here too. Around the capital, a multi-level defense system was created. The outer belt of fortifications ran along mountain ridges 50 kilometers from the city, the inner one directly in the suburbs. Tokyo itself turned into a fortress, where every building was adapted for defense. But the most terrible weapon of the Japanese became kamikaze, of a new type. They created a divine wind corps of underwater saboteurs, swimmers with magnetic minds, ready to explode together with enemy ships. Human torpedoes Kyushu attacked American transports by the dozens. March 1, 1946. Operation Coronet began. This time the Americans landed 1.5 million soldiers simultaneously at 3 sections of the coast. Air support was massive, minus 5,000 aircraft. Continuously bombed Japanese positions. The first days of the landing went relatively successfully. The Americans captured several ports and began advancing toward Tokyo. But then the Japanese struck back with forces of the 2nd Guards Army. These were elite units prepared to defend the capital. The battle's near. Tokyo surpassed all previous battles of the war in ferocity. Japanese soldiers used human wave tactics, massive attacks, regardless of losses. American positions were piled with corpses so that the next wave could advance further. Particularly bloody were the battles for Haneda Airport and Yokohama Port. Here the Japanese first used new weapons, en masse, Fukuryu rocket projectiles, controlled by suicide bombers. These living torpedoes caused enormous damage to American equipment. By April 1946, the Americans approached the outskirts of Tokyo, but the assault on the 10 million city promised to be a nightmare. Every street was blocked by barricades, snipers sat in every house. Sewer tunnels turned into a network of underground fortresses. Emperor Hirohito moved his headquarters to an underground bunker beneath the imperial palace. From here he directed the defense, calling on the people for the final sacrifice for the glory of Yamato. Tokyo radio continuously transmitted battle reports and calls to resistance. American generals understood the assault on Tokyo would claim hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. The city would have to be taken quarter by quarter, house by house. The Pentagon seriously considered the possibility of using chemical weapons. May 1, 1946. The assault on Tokyo began. American artillery and aviation unleashed thousands of tons of ammunition on the city, but the Japanese didn't surrender. Fire continued from the burning ruins at the attackers. Fighting in the city took on the character of hand-to-hand combat. American soldiers discovered with horror that they were fighting not only with military personnel, but also with civilians, women, elderly, children. All Japanese became soldiers. Particularly heavy were the battles for the Ginza district and the Imperial Palace. Here the Japanese concentrated their best units, guard regiments, ready to die for the emperor. Every building had to be taken by storm. By mid-May, the Americans controlled half of Tokyo, but losses were catastrophic. In 2 months of fighting in the capital, 300,000 American soldiers and more than 1 million Japanese died. The city lay in ruins. The turning point came on May 20th, 1946. When American Special Forces broke through to the Imperial Palace. In the underground bunker, a dramatic meeting occurred. Emperor Hirohito saw American soldiers for the first time, but even the capture of the emperor didn't break Japanese resistance. The military command announced it would fight to the last soldier. Uprisings flared throughout Japan. Guerrilla warfare engulfed the occupied territories. By summer 1946. It became obvious a military solution to the Japanese question was impossible. The U.S. had already lost 500,000 soldiers, and the end of the war was not in sight. Anti-war demonstrations began in America, calling for negotiations. President Truman convened a secret meeting at the White House. The Secretary of Defense reported grim statistics: complete conquest of Japan would require another 2 years and 1 million lives. The U.S. economy was strained to the limit simultaneously. Intelligence reported secret negotiations between Japanese generals and the Soviet Union. Stalin, seeing America's weakness, was preparing to enter the war on Japan's side to get his share. In the future, peace treaty. In August 1946, an event occurred that changed the course of the war. The Japanese submarine I-400, equipped with kamikaze aircraft, attacked the Panama Canal and seriously damaged the locks. American supply of troops in the Pacific was threatened. This was the last straw. On August 15, 1946, exactly 1 year after Japan's historical surrender, President Truman announced a ceasefire and the beginning of peace negotiations. Operation Downfall ended without achieving its goals. Negotiations took place on neutral territory in Switzerland. The Japanese delegation, led by Prince Kano, demanded preservation of imperial power and withdrawal of American forces. The U.S. insisted on democratization of the country. A compromise was found only after 6 months of painful negotiations. Japan agreed to limited reforms in exchange for preserving sovereignty. American forces were withdrawn in phases over 2 years. The peace treaty was signed on September 2, 1947, 2 years after Japan capitulated aboard the Missouri in real history. But in our alternative reality, this was not a surrender, but a compromise agreement between equal parties. The consequences of Operation Downfall's failure proved far-reaching. The U.S., having suffered enormous losses, lost its status as the sole superpower. The Soviet Union, not participating in the Japanese War, benefited from America's weakening. Japan, though destroyed by war, preserved its statehood and national pride. The emperor remained a symbol of the nation, and the samurai spirit wasn't broken. This created prerequisites for future conflicts. In America, Operation Downfall forever changed attitudes toward war. Pacifist sentiments became widespread. Country that lost the flower of its youth on Japanese islands never again decided on such adventures. Veterans of the Japanese War woke up the whole house with their screams for a long time. They saw burning Tokyo in dreams, heard the banzai of attacking Japanese, felt the smell of gunpowder and blood. This war left non-healing wounds in the souls of an entire generation. General MacArthur, who dreamed of becoming the hero conqueror of Japan, retired in shadow and oblivion. His memoirs were never written. The memories of failure were too painful. And what about the atomic bombs? In our alternative history, the U.S. used them tactically against Japanese fortifications on Kyushu. But this didn't break the Japanese will to resist. Radiation made parts of the island uninhabitable for decades. Japan in the post-war years recovered more slowly than in real history. The destruction was colossal. Almost all major cities lay in ruins. But the spirit of the nation wasn't broken, and this gave strength for revival. The economic miracles still happened, but with a decade's delay. Japan of the 1960s became a powerful industrial power. But with strong nationalist sentiments and militaristic traditions, in the 1970s, a cult of memory of the heroes of Operation Ketsugo arose in Japan. Museums, memorials, films glorified those who fought against the American invasion. This created tension in relations with the U.S. The Cold War took on a different character. Instead of a bipolar US-USSR world, a triangle emerged with Japan's participation. Tokyo maneuvered between the superpowers, extracting benefit from their confrontation. The Korean War of 1952-53 proceeded without American participation. The U.S. was too exhausted by the Japanese conflict. This allowed China and the USSR to establish control over the entire Korean peninsula. The Vietnam War also didn't occur in the familiar form. America, remembering the nightmare of Japanese jungles and urban battles, avoided large-scale ground operations. The policy of containing communism took other forms, and now we approach the moment we promised to tell about at the very beginning. What secret weapon did the Japanese prepare, and why did American generals call Operation Downfall the gates of hell? The fact is that the Japanese developed a biological weapons program under the codename Unit 731 in secret laboratories. In Manchuria, Japanese scientists created deadly bacteria and viruses. The plan was monstrous: to infect American troops with plague, anthrax, and other deadly diseases. Fortunately for humanity, in our alternative history, this weapon was never used. The Japanese command feared an uncontrolled epidemic. But American intelligence knew about these plans, and that's exactly why the generals called the invasion of Japan the gates of hell. Imagine millions of soldiers infected with unknown diseases returning home to America. An epidemic could have destroyed civilization. Perhaps the failure of Operation Downfall saved the world from a biological catastrophe. Thus ended the bloodiest operation in the alternative history of humanity. An operation that changed the course of the 20th century and showed that even the most powerful military machine can be shattered against the will of a people defending their homeland. A lesson that humanity must never forget. The psychological impact on American society was profound. The generation that fought in Japan carried invisible scars that would never heal. Veterans' hospitals overflowed with men who had seen too much, endured too much. The American dream of invincibility was shattered on the beaches of Kyushu. In the decades that followed, historians would debate whether the operation could have succeeded with different tactics, more resources, or better intelligence. But the fundamental truth remained: Japan in 1945 was a nation willing to sacrifice everything for its survival. No amount of firepower could overcome that level of determination. The technological innovations born from the desperate fighting would influence military doctrine for generations. Urban warfare tactics developed in the ruins of Tokyo became standard training for armies worldwide. The brutal lessons learned in Japanese cities would be applied in conflicts from Berlin to Stalingrad in alternative timelines. International law was forever changed by the conduct of Operation Downfall. The massive civilian casualties, the use of human shields, and the deliberate targeting of non-combatants led to new Geneva Conventions. The world had seen what total war truly meant and recoiled in horror. The economic consequences rippled through both nations for decades. Japan's infrastructure was so thoroughly destroyed that rebuilding took an entire generation. American war debt, already staggering, ballooned to levels that required fundamental changes to the global financial system. Perhaps most significantly, the failure of Operation Downfall marked the end of the age of great power invasions. Never again would a nation attempt such a massive amphibious assault against a prepared enemy. The cost in blood and treasure was simply too high for any democracy to sustain. The memory of Operation Downfall lived on in both cultures, but in vastly different ways. In America, it became a cautionary tale about the limits of military power and the importance of diplomacy. In Japan, it became a source of national pride, proof that the warrior spirit could triumph over overwhelming odds. Children on both sides of the Pacific grew up with stories of the Great Invasion. American children learned about the brave Marines who fought impossible battles. Japanese children heard tales of citizens who stood against the mightiest army in history. Both narratives contained truth, and both shaped the worldview of new generations. The veterans themselves rarely spoke of what they experienced. The horror was too great, the memories too painful. It would be decades before memoirs began to appear. And even then, many details remained unspoken. Some truths were too dark for the written word. Military academies around the world studied Operation Downfall as the ultimate example of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The tactical lessons were numerous, but the strategic lesson was singular. Know your enemy. Understand their will to fight, and be prepared for any sacrifice they might make. The alternative timeline created by this failed invasion changed everything. Without American dominance in the Pacific, the balance of power shifted dramatically. China's civil war ended differently. Korea remained divided along different lines. The entire trajectory of the Cold War was altered by America's Pacific weakness. In this world where Operation Downfall failed, nuclear weapons took on a different significance. Having proven ineffective against a determined enemy, they became less of an ultimate weapon and more of a deterrent against conventional invasion. The nuclear age began not with surrender, but with stalemate. The medical advances born from treating the massive casualties of Operation Downfall accelerated healing techniques by decades. Battlefield surgery, prosthetics for the disabled, and treatments for psychological trauma all advanced rapidly out of necessity. Every catastrophe contained seeds of progress. Environmental consequences lasted for generations. The radioactive zones created by tactical nuclear weapons in Kyushu became dead zones that slowly recovered. The burned cities of Japan struggled with contamination from destroyed factories and chemical plants. Nature bore scars as deep as those carried by the survivors. Cultural exchange between America and Japan was forever altered. Instead of occupier and occupied, they became equals who had tested each other to the breaking point. This created a different kind of respect, one born not from victory and defeat, but from mutual recognition of courage and determination. The failure of Operation Downfall also changed how future conflicts were approached. Limited wars became more common as nations learned the impossibility of total victory against a determined opponent. The age of absolute conquest was ending, replaced by an era of negotiated settlements. As the decades passed, survivors on both sides began to meet. Veterans groups arranged exchanges where former enemies could share their experiences. These meetings were often emotional affairs as men who had tried to kill each other discovered their commo.